Hello, everybody, and welcome back to our last unit in world religion. So we've come all the way around the world. We're now in the Middle East with the third of the great world religions that come out of the Middle East, and particularly Christianity and Islam that come out of Judaism. So I'm going to start with a little bit of just background comment, and we will do the life of Muhammad and scriptures. So uh, Islam then is let's see. Sorry about that. We'll get it together. So just a few preliminary comments. So Islam is a name that the followers of Muhammad took on within his lifetime, and it comes from the same word as peace. And so salam, shalom in the Hebrew, uh, peace with the secondary meaning of surrender. So the peace that comes from surrendering one's life to God, that is what it means to be a Muslim. And then the word Allah just literally means God or the God. So this is a monotheistic tradition that, and we'll talk about that in a while, but to be a Muslim then is total and unqualified submission to Allah. So to be a Muslim, that's it. So what does that involve, right? So let's start with the background because we do have a founder, again, like Christianity and some other religions in Muhammad. And so what was this situation? So we have to think about Arabia, the Arabian Peninsula, the Middle East in the 500s, 600s CE. This was basically a Bedouin tribal society located in nomadic tribes. It's a combination of these nomadic tribes and oasis cities. So Mecca was an oasis city, for example. And so the world was organized around family, clan, and tribe. There were no overarching governments beyond that of the tribal leadership and the uh, individual leadership of the leadership of the individual cities. A fair amount of commerce took place in this region via caravan as they took some of these precious rare goods out of that region and traded them with the rest of the world. So this is a big part of this, and that's what connected the nomadic tribes and the oasis cities. But because there was no overarching government in the region, there was a great deal of tribal and intercity warfare. And so, in many ways, it was a free for all. And there are some parallels with Confucius and his time in the Warring States period, but not to that degree. This was just a region that did not have any centralized leadership. So a lot of conflict between the tribes. So uh, we then get to talk about pre-Islamic religion. So remember that this is the region of Judaism as well. So among the tribes, these that were a part of the nomadic peoples and the oasis cities, there were Jewish tribes, there were groups of Christians, and then, of course, many of the tribes practiced indigenous practices like moon worship, the moon goddess right here. So it was a real mixture. So all these clans were loyal to different divine beings. And so you have then both sort of a political and economic lawlessness and a sort of free for all in the religion. How Allah did form a part of these traditions, but he was at this point one among many. So, in other words, Muhammad didn't come up with Allah; he just elevated Allah over the other gods and goddesses of his own tribe who were pagans. So, I want to focus a little on Mecca because Mecca, even in that day, had a unique was a unique city even in that time. So basically, it was a major part of the caravan trade. So the Bedouin tribesmen, the nomadic peoples would come to towns like Mecca to trade and to have their goods delivered. But it also, what makes Mecca a bit different from others is that it was a major pilgrimage site. And there were, dozens of different gods that were worshipped in various regions. And so, whereas all the oasis cities relied on on trade for their source of income, Mecca had also this sort of tourism, religious tourism. But it is also important to know that with all these many gods, that there was also a strong tradition in Mecca connecting it to Abraham. So there are all sorts of legends about Abraham's connection to Mecca that survived outside of the biblical records, that were part of the folklore of the people of Mecca. Abraham was very much a part of their own history. Of course, they call him Ibrahim. And so here is an Islamic image of the story of the deer sacrifice of Isaac. It occurs, that story is also told in in the Quran, but in the Quran it is not Isaac, it's Ishmael or Ismail, who is the child who is near sacrificed. But some of you may already be aware that the Kaaba, the most important site, the rock that is embedded into that building, pre-exists Islam and was said to have been built or placed there by Abraham. So let's talk about Muhammad. He is born in Mecca in about 570, as you can see. He was a part of the very important Quraysh tribe, and that was both a blessing and a curse. One other thing about Mecca that I will say that I did not say above is that various different tribes and clans controlled the different pilgrimage sites. So if there were different gods, then all the money that would come in for the moon goddess, for example, that was owned by family A, and they would take all the proceeds from that. The Quraysh tribe, and Muhammad's family in particular, they had economic control over those particular sites that were connected with Abraham. So he had a specific family connection to these Abrahamic sites. So this is a very tribal society. His father, very significant man in his family, but he died before his son was born, and this put Muhammad into a very difficult situation. He was under his grandfather's protection for a while, and then at his grandfather's death, an uncle. But he still didn't really belong in the way that a son whose father was still alive could belong in the society. So his situation in Mecca, in society, it was precarious. It was both part of what made him the man that he is, but also endangered him at times. So he had no one place. One of the things that, if you read a biography of Muhammad, one of the more common practices of the time, people believed that Mecca was dirty and the air was bad. So they would foster their children to these particular Bedouin groups who lived up in the mountains for several years. So they'd literally send their children as infants or toddlers, young people, to these tribes. And then when the child had been raised to a certain point, they thought that child would be healthier, would come back to Mecca and be raised by his family. The thing is, though, because Mecca, so here's one of these issues of not having a protector, is that there was no one to whereas someone did foster Muhammad, there was no one to take him back. His mother was not able to take him. And so he spent many, many, many more years living among the Bedouin tribes people of Arabia than in his own home, and then compared to his peers. So, because that gets me to his to the next stage of his life. He does eventually come back to Mecca, is raised by his mother under the protection of his grandfather and then his uncle, and he took on a job in a caravan business. And He was, because he had spent so much time with these nomadic herdsmen, he was known for his ability to work with camels and livestock. But he also became known as a very pure hearted, gentle, and well loved person. Um, so, who he was as a person was just as important, obviously, as his position. He did eventually begin to work for a woman named Kadia, whom he eventually married. Kadia is his first wife, and she was, that always talks about 15 years his senior, but very much a supporter and a advocate. They did have 7 children together, although none of the sons survived to adulthood. The one had 2 daughters. Fatima is the most famous, and we want to hold on to this because these 2 figures, Fatima and Ali, become very important in the second wave of Islam. So Muhammad's cousin, his daughter marries his cousin. Kind of seems to be the thing to do. They're all, almost all of these original leaders are in some ways connected by marriage. So again, then we tell these stories of this sort of man that doesn't really quite fit into the power structure of Mecca. He's good with animals. He's well loved, happily married. But it does talk about how he had a very spiritual side, and he would climb up into the mountains outside of Mecca, a place called Mount Hira, and meditate in the caves. And so we get to the night of power, Muhammad's religious awakening. So here's an image of Mount Hira, and that is we. So he's 6'10", and 6'10", during one of his meditations at Mount Hira, he has an encounter with the angel Gabriel, and this is what is known as the night of power. So there's an image of that. Here's another image of Mount Hira. You can see the buildings of Mecca in the foreground. So the angel Gabriel comes to Muhammad in the cave and appoints him as the prophet of God. So weird translation, but in the name of your Lord, who created basically mortal man, your Lord is wondrous kind, who teaches by the pen things men knew not, being blind. And so you've got an early reference to what becomes the Quran. And so the angel Gabriel then, over the course of, so the night of power is his moment when he is appointed as God's prophet through the angel Gabriel. He continues to have encounters with the angel Gabriel, who reveals to him over the course of his life the words that eventually become the Quran. So Muhammad then, here's another image of the cave, by the way. This is what after this night, he comes back down to the city of Mecca with this. Allah was not just the most impressive God, but the only true God. So this idea of monotheism is central to the religious understanding of Islam. And that not only was Allah the only God, but Muhammad was his appointed prophet. And so this is what it really means to be a Muslim, is to accept Allah as the one true God and Muhammad as his prophet. And so, like I said, also during the night of power, he gets his first recitations from the angel Gabriel that eventually are written down to become the Quran. So he goes back down to the city. He speaks with his wife. He does actually even speak to a Christian man who lives in the city of Mecca about his visions, because he does. The biographies seem to indicate that he wasn't quite sure. He thought maybe he was just a little crazy. And so he comes down, he talks to his wife, he talks to his friend Abu Bakr, but he also talks to another man, and a Christian, another monotheistic believer, who encourages him and says that this is indeed the Word of God. And so he begins then to tell other people about his message, his cousin Ali, the one who eventually marries his daughter. And he begins to convert. And so these people, about 40 converts by the end of the decade, several hundred families, they would meet together to worship Allah and recite portions of words that would become part of the Quran. So that goes on, but there are reasons why the Meccan society doesn't really look too favorable upon what's going on with Muhammad. So here's again, this is an ancient image of the angel Gabriel coming to Muhammad on Mount Hira. So basically, to preach a full-blown monotheism is a threat, because they make their money off of these pilgrimages and the polytheistic belief system. So he is cutting at their very source of wealth. But also, given the injustices that were being carried out in this lawless period, he took very much to that ethical, that deep ethic that we see beginning in Judaism, and said, no, we can't act like lawless people. We have to follow certain ethical practices. And also, he didn't really have a protector, so his social standing was always a part of this as well. So there are a lot of trouble, a lot of issues that make it very difficult for Muhammad and his followers. So they're going on in sort of an uneasy status quo until the year 622. This was a dangerous period. Basically, there is a city up the coast called Yathrib, so you can see the name there. You may not, know the city, but it now goes under a different name. There were multiple tribes in Yathrib, some Jewish tribes, some pagan tribes, some Christian tribes, and they were in the midst of a pretty heavy-duty civil war. And there was a custom back then that you could bring in an external arbitrator, an independent individual who could help arbitrate these issues. So Muhammad's reputation as a man of wisdom and ethics reaches Yathrib. So Yathrib said, the leaders go to him and say, come be our mediator, and we will allow you to freely worship Allah, to implement your teachings, to evangelize among our people. And many people do convert to Islam in Yathrib. But this migration, he is asked then to go to Yathrib. By the way, so moving on, this is it is the Hijra that is understood as the beginning of Islam as a religion. This is the date that they base their calendar on. So the formation of the Ummah, and we'll talk more about that, but the community of faith begins when Muhammad and eventually his followers, it's actually too dangerous for them all just to get up and move, so they have to sort of slowly migrate out of the city. Muhammad is helped. They try to murder him on his way out, but eventually he and his followers all end up in Yathrib, and he becomes basically the leader, or the one who arbitrates between all of these various little different groups in Yathrib. So again, he becomes a major political military leader, not just in Yathrib, but also in the region as he gains more and more power. Yathrib then is known as Medinat al-Nabi, city of the prophet, and so today you know it better as Medina rather than Yathrib. And so here is, and you can see how huge this is. This is the mosque complex at Medina. The Muhammad took up residence inside the original mosque there in Medina, so it is also his burial is inside this particular building. So, move on. We're skipping a lot of history, but as Medina grows in power, as Muhammad's control over the region becomes stronger and stronger, he eventually butts up against one of the other major cities, which is Mecca, his hometown, and they are not. There's a lot of personal quarrels going on because of, and you know, a lot of we're still talking in many ways about family, of the larger tribe and clan and cousins and stuff like that. But in a series of battles back and forth, Muhammad eventually conquers Mecca in 630. And so this is understood not just as Muhammad conquering his old city, but as a victory for the faith. So when Muhammad goes back to Mecca as the triumphant warrior, the city essentially becomes an Islamic city. All the other pagan worship sites are taken down, and the Kaaba is rededicated to Allah. Allah, again, this is all connected with Abraham, so that's how they get their tie back to Judaism. And eventually, Mecca becomes the geographic center of Islam. So nowadays, they all pray in the direction of Mecca, and we'll talk about the pilgrimages that take place to the city. But this is the Mecca, and so this is the famous building with the Kaaba with the black rock inside it. So, however, Muhammad does not choose to return to Mecca personally. He lives then, goes back to Medina, and dies in 632. We've skipped over a lot about his multiple wives. There's a lot of stuff that gets overblown about that. He did marry some of the women he married were very young, but from all appearances, without any sort of prejudicial reading of Islam, it does appear that in some ways he was rescuing women of family members and stuff like that. I don't know what you've heard, and we won't go into it. But he is then buried in the mosque in Medina. But at this point, the entire Arabian Peninsula is under his control. So he is starting from that moment, the Hijra, when he goes to Medina, he consolidates his power and his military and political influence until by the time of his death he controls a large amount of territory. So he is a religious. I think that's important, that Muhammad at his death was obviously a religious leader and the prophet and teacher, but he was also a political leader and a military leader. He had his own army. So this is one sense where, when we try and compare Christianity and Islam, the idea, certain ideas that are where Christianity, where Jesus was only ever a religious leader and never had political power, that Muhammad had all three. And so their understanding the relationship between their faith and their political systems is bound to be very different. So, and here's another image of the angel Gabriel speaking to Muhammad. So then ultimately, just a few comments about Muhammad. He is referred to as the seal of the prophets. Seal as in shut it down and put a seal on it. He is the final prophet. There is no more revelation to come. But the Mus- Muslim tradition understands that all of the prophets of the Old Testament, starting with Abraham and going up through Jesus himself, were all sent by Allah. I think that's, and there's another question, that is Allah, you know, is is he the same as Yahweh? Is he the same as the God of Christianity? Some people would say yes, some people would say no. But as far as Islam understands it, they see this same God working through all of this. So they would say yes, that the God that Jesus worshipped is Allah, that the God that the Old Testament called Yahweh is Allah. And so he is then all these prophets came and brought the message, uh, but and so Muhammad then, why did they need Muhammad? Not that these earlier prophets, Abraham, Amos, Jesus, were not true prophets, but that for some reason in their delivery or in the what people heard, their messages were corrupted and were misunderstood. So basically, Islam would say it's not newer than Christianity and Judaism. It is older. It's because it's been the same message from the very beginning. But only Muhammad got it right. So that's important to understand how Islam understands its roots in Judaism and its relationship to Christianity. Same God, same message, but everybody seems to have misunderstood it until Muhammad. So we'll pause there for a second and I'll come back and talk a little bit about what happens after Muhammad dies.